Good morning, Becky. Thank you so much for being here today.
Of course. Good morning, Miss Van. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. Becky is a principal administrator. She's been an administrator since 2005, so she's got lots of experience, which is why I wanted her perspective on this book, because she sees lots of these kinds of things of blaming others on the playground, in the classroom, helping kids learn about responsibility. So I thought this was a great story to share and to get your perspective on. So I wanted to just sort of review real quick the story, but not go through it all because I've done that on a different video. But this is a story about Seymour, the blue-footed booby, who has a difficult time because he doesn't know how to solve problems. If two birds get the ball at the same time, what do we do? If somebody says you're out, what do we do? Those kinds of things, which I'm sure you see all the time on the playground, because I hear about it a lot in my sessions with kids.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is one of the most common sorts of issues that we have, to be honest, on the playground, is just when kids are playing a game together, and there is no like official referee, how do they kind of sort out the rules and try to come to agreements? And I think that's one thing that's really nice about the book, is that it kind of steps through all the different components of having, good consensus making and strategies that kids can learn to try to manage their game and manage their emotions. Because kids play hard, they love to play the games as hard as they can, and they get really invested in it. But there definitely is some strategies that they can learn to make sure that they're having a more harmonious and positive experience altogether.
Yeah, I love that. They play hard. They do. They are invested in their games and those points, as was the bird in the story. So in the end, the main idea is like how the bird's reactions, different reactions from the birds. And I think this is pretty realistic about what goes on in the playground. I also tried to also model some more pro-social behaviors that some kids, to motivate some kids who are able to think about another way to respond to something, with the idea in mind that not all kids can play the game quite the same way as you can, maybe, and you could help somebody along. And so I think that's a lesson for lots of kids who have that ability to look a little beyond themselves and see who else can be brought in and be included and supported when something doesn't seem so easy for them, but it is for the person who's available to help. So that's
I think that's a really good point, because always there are some children who maybe have just better control over their emotions. They might still play hard, but they might just be a little bit better at taking a step back. And I like the story because it's a nice story just on the surface level. It's a fun story to read. I think it'll be engaging for the students, but it also really kind of every part of the story is important, right? It's teaching the kids how to how to take a break, how to pause and step back, which is really that's a life skill that that the adults reading the story might need to remember too, right?
exactly.
It's the kids are not always seeing modeled in today's world. Everybody's in such a rush, and even on the streets, like I feel like driving around, people just are less patient, and so the kids are not necessarily always seeing a good model of how to take a break or take a step back when something is upsetting to them. And so I like the way that the story just kind of like breaks down what are the steps to do that, while still presenting something that is not just a checklist. It's an engaging children's story that is fun to read also. So I think that it has a social story in it, but it's also has really great illustrations and engaging dialogue. It's a nice story, a standalone, besides the message that's included in it.
Oh, thank you so much, Becky. I appreciate it. So you've kind of told the story, which is great.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I appreciate that, because now we can move on to the other part of what I wanted to do with you, and that is to talk about the things that kids can do to help reinforce those messages and make it more likely that that will actually happen on your playground, and also give some tools for the adults who are trying to support the kids. So I'll move on over to that. And so this is a story. These are extra little activities that are on my website that anybody can access to help try to think, how can I help my child? What are the lessons, like you're saying, Becky, that I can bring into the moment to help a child grow? So the best case scenario, worst case scenario, most likely case scenario. This is just an example of Seymour didn't know how to solve the problem. And so many times, I'm sure you see as well, the worst case scenario is what kids go to. It's
Mhm.
not fair. You had the ball more times than I had it, those kinds of things. And the ones who keep track of, you had it 5 times, I've only had it 3 times, those kind of things. And
Right.
so figuring out the most likely case scenario, this is just an example so that kids can model from this example what they could do in similar situations. So it's just going through, like, both birds listening would be the best case scenario, and actually communicating and thinking about a plan that works for everybody. And the worst case scenario would be that they can't agree on a solution. They just keep fighting, carry a grudge, demand an apology. I'm sure you see that as well, and insist that the game be fair. And then nobody has any fun, and nobody gets to have any fun because all the time is spent arguing. And that's one thing I see in my social skills groups. Kids absolutely do not like spending their
Mhm.
time arguing about rules or whether you're
Yeah.
out or not.
Yeah,
Like,
I think that, that's one of the things that is so nice about the story too, is that it does really reinforce that the real point is to get back in the game and have fun playing the game, right?
yes,
We don't want to spend our whole recess time in an argument. And I think that that's something that can appeal to everybody. Nobody's going to say, yes, I want to spend my whole time
yeah,
arguing. So
absolutely.
I think those, and I like the way you incorporated in the story, like what seems like a little VR headset, right? So they can see kind of in virtual reality, model, like modeling out or thinking out, like, what would this look like if I had this response? So they can kind of picture and project ahead, like you're saying, what is the best case scenario is if we learn to just solve the conflict quickly so we can move on with the game and everyone gets back into it using a neutral method like rock paper scissors, or there are many different things you can do, but the idea being that you just try to resolve it as quickly as possible and move on with the game so that it doesn't derail the limited amount of time they have to play. And so I think that that's a great strategy, and kids sometimes, especially kids who are struggling with anxiety, do tend to catastrophize, right? And kind of think about, like, this could, their vision of how it could go is perhaps maybe like slanted more towards the negative, right? Whereas it's like some kids will come into the conflict and assume positive intent from the other child, right? But when kids are kind of worrying about the worst case scenario, sometimes it's hard to let things go like that. So having a concrete solution and strategy that they can use to resolve the conflict without it being, turning it into a bigger thing than it really is, right?
Yeah, yeah. Very well said, Becky. That's exactly right. And in my social skills groups, I try to simulate it like a recess time. It's exactly what I see. And if I say, do you guys want to keep talking about it, or do you want to just play? Oh,
Right.
it's solved instantly. And so this is just an example of a best case, worst case, and most likely case scenario that kids can cut and paste. So I'm trying to bring my occupational therapy background into some of
Yeah.
the activities. Um, so here are some of the ideas you mentioned, like some ways that kids, well, some other things that kids might not have, um, that are not easy for kids, and some ways that they could solve the problem. So these are just ideas, so they could draw a picture of a situation like these on this handout here, like a sibling is ahead in Candyland and you don't like to lose. What should you do? So problem solving, you could work through the worst, best, most likely case scenario, just like you said, like looking into the future a little bit, and what do you want the situation to be like, and what will happen if you, well, more like in the story, what will happen if you do this, what will happen if you
Mhm.
do this. So um, I, I see so many of these. I mean, it was easy for me to come up with a long list because It's so
Yeah.
hard. So many of these things are hard for so many kids, and they just don't have the practice or the scaffolding to know how to do that, which is the whole reason I'm writing all these stories.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think that, just having been a school administrator for a long time, I do think that we're seeing some increase in certain sorts of difficulties that we didn't see before. Everyone was in the COVID protocols, and for kids who were little during that time, I think initially, we really were concerned about the kids who missed kindergarten, first grade, second grade. But now that we're seeing some kids who are younger than that during the time of the shutdown entering school, it's pretty apparent that there is some early learning that was missed, right? That's even more foundational in regards to how do you handle some of these things. And I think it's important to just frame that it's not necessarily it's some let me rephrase that. It is something that we can address directly through stories like this, right? So it's not the kids' fault that they didn't have these experiences. They didn't have the opportunity, many of them, to have exposure to students, to other peers when they were 2 and 3 years old. And those are the times where kids really move from doing that parallel play to playing together. And since they didn't have that opportunity, now they're approaching those situations and those scenarios at a different sort of developmental time, right? And they haven't had those experiences earlier. And so those are things that normally by the time kids come to kindergarten or first grade, they've had ample opportunity, at least in our school community. They would have had ample opportunity through preschool or other sorts of social things, even going to the park, right? So there was a period of time where kids were not allowed to go to the park. I remembered this the other day, and how that was just so unbelievable to me at the time. And I remember the day that they reopened the parks, and I took my own personal child, who's 9 now, so he was in kindergarten at the time, or TK at the time of the shutdown. I remember going to the park reopening day, and we went to 4 parks, and at that time everyone was wearing a mask, and the kids still had to stay 6 feet apart. And so they just had a very different sort of upbringing in the early time. And it's something that we collectively, everybody experienced that, right? I think it's easy now that our lives are essentially back to normal to kind of forget how restricted that was for them. And so I think that stories like this are just such a good way of trying to create some pro-social skills that the kids might have missed, not by any fault of their own or their parents, but just because as a society we have to keep separate in order, to maintain safety. But it definitely had an effect on this age group of children who are now, potentially 4 to 7 years old, who were not in school during the shutdown, but were younger than that and missed some important social experiences.
Absolutely, Becky. We're having this effect for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is just a place where they can draw some of the pictures that we were just talking about. And so this is just a little maze, super easy to do, but all of these activities are meant to be conversation starters.
Right.
What happened here with the bird? Like, it tells the story that some of the birds didn't like it. They talked it out. He used his badge, and then everybody had fun. And then he was actually able to move on to other birds who were also having a disagreement about a ball, because he had learned something, and he has now the skills to go offer help to somebody else. And so,
Yeah.
so much to talk about in this little game here.
Yeah, I do think that this is one of the things that for all students in all of my experience as an educator, this is one of the things that is most important to help children who have behavioral struggles, which is that often they have a difficult time representing in their mind kind of the steps that are taken to resolve a conflict. And then related but separate, maybe an idea for another book, is how do you repair a situation when something has gone wrong between 2 people? Because these sort of things, as you mentioned, are inevitable. There are going to be conflicts like this that happen on the playground in life. 2 people pulling into wanting to pull into a parking space at the same time as adults, right? You see people getting into road rage incidences, which are basically this scenario.
Yes,
So
exactly.
how do we help kids to be able to kind of make more transparent and visual the steps that they need to go through in order to successfully make it through a conflict, and then share their learning with others, right? So that, I like that you've incorporated that into the book too, because it's not just about taking care of ourselves. It's also about how can we have a positive effect on the learning community. And in this story, Seymour definitely does that, because he's able to kind of take a step back and look at the different components of how he could respond. And then using, you know, the badge, which this with the steps is a tool that he can use, but then it helps him to become a leader in the community. And I can tell you that I've seen that over time. I can think of a class a long time ago that was in my school, where there were many students who had Asperger's in that class. And as a result, we had done a lot of social stories and a lot of direct instruction about social communication. And by the time that group was in 4th grade, they had the best social skills of anybody, because they had received so much direct instruction. And you would never have guessed it when you saw their interactions. But it's because we did take the time, because we knew we had this cluster of kids in this grade level, to really do a lot of direct instruction. And these things are things you can learn. People can learn how to use these structures, and it provides a lot of comfort to the students to understand how to respond to these situations. And then they can truly become leaders and perhaps know it better than for people who it might be intuitive for.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. You're exactly what I wanted to get across. This is just a list. I won't go through the whole list just because of time, but there's all kinds of ideas of how to solve problems when you're playing with other kids. So rock, paper, scissors, which you mentioned, and the one that all kids know, go ask a grown-up for help, but that doesn't, there's not always somebody who can actually be available to do that. But one of the things that I think most of the kids that I work with think that is a pretty good solution almost always is rock, paper, scissors. It's quick. They'd never argue about it. Sometimes I have kids who say, I never win. I never am. And of course, that's the never always set. And so it's harder for them to be able to play rock, paper, scissors, because it doesn't feel as fair as it does for other kids. Because their perception, like you said, that negative bias is I never get to, or I never win. And so that's a different lesson, different book, like you said.
Yeah.
And then this is why are kids arguing? Like you've told a lot of the reasons. And a big part of it truly is COVID. And but a lot of it is I'm just taking that from you because I don't have the language skills. I don't have the ability to wait, to step back, like you're saying. I can't do those things yet. I haven't had the support, haven't had the practice, haven't had someone show me and walk with me through this over and over again to see that I can still get what I want, but there's other ways of doing it that are a little bit more other kids are more willing to work with me if I do it that way. And like you've said, it's the steps. It does mean be mindful, take a break, think, just take a minute. And I often say to kids, that how long did that take? And they know it didn't take very long to just ask, could I have a turn with that?
I think that's a really good point, is that one thing I know at our school that we really focus on is trying to teach the children to be reflective. And we also as a staff try to be reflective. And so that part in there, what stands out to me on this list is finding it difficult to process the language of peers. And I think that this happens for lots of different reasons. It can happen because students have, kind of like a speech issue about receptive or productive language, but it also can be when kids are emotionally activated, right? So if the kid is upset, that actually impacts our ability to understand other people's language. And I don't think that that's commonly known, right? But it is. And if we think about it, if we reflect as adults on it, I'm sure we can find examples where we perhaps did not understand what one of our peers was trying to explain to us when we were upset, right? So I think, again, all these things are they're good lessons for everybody who's reading the story, including the adults, good reminder, right? But the language, I mean, we really always try to approach all kinds of conflicts. This is one of the first things I think about, is that what is it that was understood by each party? And it might not be what is expected, right? Because maybe it doesn't seem that complicated, but things, when people are under stress and emotionally upset, then it's easy to cast the intention of another person in a different light than it really is. When maybe somebody's just being neutral, it can seem as if they're trying to create conflict, when really that's not the case, just because we ourselves are so upset about it. So I think that when kids do have conflicts on the playground or in general, thinking of it from a position of, what is this person who's upset actually receiving from the other person? And I've been a high school administrator and worked with lots of different populations, including students who are in the court and community schools, people who've been expelled and are incarcerated. And it's really the same issue in high school as it is in elementary school. So that's one that I think is important to call out, is that learning, when we feel upset, learning to take a break, take a breath, and really trying to understand the situation. But we can't do that when we are actively upset. So that's the purpose of, taking that space or taking that break, removing yourself so that you can try to regulate your emotions and then move towards trying to understand. But when we are actively upset, it's very difficult to take the perspective of the other person and the disagreement.
So well said, Becky. Yes, absolutely. And that's what I see all the
Yeah.
time. As you're saying, I mean, we see it and it's just hard. But that's why, like, well, what's the reality? I often think, I wish I had a video camera so they could see what actually
Right.
happened, because you're putting a slant on it that is different than what somebody else's perspective of it was. And
Yeah.
it's really hard. But when I can catch kids in a with my phone doing something, then I can show them the video
Mhm.
and I don't even have to say anything. They see it themselves. So
Right.
it's perfect. So that's kind of where I came up with the idea of, well,
Yeah.
let's do stories where they can see it felt like this.
Mhm.
What actually happened if you didn't have your feelings, your emotions mixed in there
Right.
with it?
And again, that's true for the adults in the situation too, right? It's true for, if
Absolutely.
we have a disagreement about loading the dishwasher, or, anything that comes up, it's often not quite how it feels when we get upset about something.
Absolutely. And then these are just, kids can have their own future vision goggles. And so if you wanted to talk about something that happened, you could say, let's make our own, and then let's see what it looks
Mhm.
like. And
It's nice.
different perspective. And this is, they could draw a solution on here. And then that's the end of, oh, and then this one is just, what are the differences? So these are the reactions that the birds had when there was the arguing at the top and at the bottom. It's like, oh, well, let's just play. We've got a plan. We're just going to do
Right.
paper, scissors, or whatever the plan is.
Yeah.
And then this is kind of what you were just saying, actually. How
Mhm.
can you re-say things like, I get to go first, or which one of these would be a way that could maybe get different results, or
Mhm.
you have to be it. So all of these are kind of, not all of them, but some of them feel controlling. And one I hear sometimes is, you have to say sorry.
Mhm.
So that one, like you were saying, like, how do we repair a relationship? They don't know, so they think that that's the answer, but you can't make somebody do it. And so
Yeah.
then they stay upset and don't understand. So
Yeah.
how could it be different?
And I think the thing for that one, because some adults have a really big reaction to the idea of saying sorry also.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think that, what I've learned over time about that is that saying sorry is not a way of saying I'm guilty. And I think
Uh-huh.
sometimes people think that if they
Yeah.
apologize for something, that they're somehow accepting responsibility, or like admitting that they did something wrong. But I always try to cast it that the apology is not necessarily even for your action, it's for how the other person felt because of what happened, right? So it's not up for like argument about whether the person feels that way or not, because everyone has their own feelings, right? So it doesn't necessarily, because somebody might be upset about something that you did not intend you didn't intend, but it could still upset the other person, right? So how do you become the sort of person who can be empathetic and understand other people's emotions and attend to that. It's not just about what your intention was, right? Because sometimes we do things that are not intended to harm another person, and they do create harm for another person. And that, in the larger context of our society, I think we have to learn how to, it's not all about intent, right? Sometimes there is harm that is done, even if somebody was not trying to snatch the ball from you, or somebody was not trying to, so many different things that can happen with adults. But it's really acknowledging that the other person is having a feeling, and that was not your intention, or that you do not want that person to feel like that moving forward. It's not an admission of guilt, right? Or like, I did this, it doesn't necessarily mean that you meant to cause harm.
And it takes the sting out so much for the
Right.
child receiving any
Yeah.
level of empathy. Like, I'm sorry
Yeah.
that happened. How can I help?
Exactly. Or I'm sorry that you are feeling that way, even, right? I'm sorry that this thing happened that caused you to feel this way. Is not mean I meant to cause you harm. Those are two different things.
Yeah.
I just want to share one other little thing. We've been working on these new math strategies at our school, where the teachers are interfacing with the students in a different sort of way. So the kids are working together in groups on these vertical whiteboards, and they are given a problem to work on without a lot of prefacing or instructions, but they're just given a task, and they're trying to work together to solve the problem. And the teacher's role in these sort of tasks is to go around and ask questions of the group without trying to correct them, right? And it's hard to do that, because as teachers we're taught like to correct strategies, and so there's that learning. But then the thing that I've noticed, that as we've been working on this, like for the kids, when they start to hear us asking questions instead of giving corrections, then they also now they're much better at it than we are, right? Because they're not as set in their ways. So there's a part of the time when we do that sort of activity that they go around to different groups and try to provide help, or try to, if they don't know how to solve it, they can go to another group. And I've just noticed that the older kids in particular have started to, instead of explain it, they'll ask them questions like, what did you not understand about this? Or, and I just think it's so interesting, because as educators, we're often put in the position of, instructing directly, telling people, I'm going to do it. Now we're going to do it together. And now you're going to go and do it. But the thing that's really more natural sometimes is like, you're in a real situation, you're trying to work together, and then you can provide assistance by asking questions. So I see a parallel between that and this story, in regards to like, how do you approach when something is not going right? That applies to things that are academic too, right? So if you don't understand something, instead of just throwing it, I'm not good at math, or I'm not good at this, how do you try to seek help from the group? And that is really, I think, the way of tomorrow, is for us to improve the skills, so that people can work together and find consensus within their group, instead of having somebody always directing and telling them, because that's what today's work world is like too, right? Is to be a good group member. It's so important, and it's not really a big focus in our education in general. People don't normally think about how can we support those things. I mean, they're acknowledged, but they're not central, right? But how do you be a good group member? How do you deal with it when things don't go right? So I just love the fact that you've created this story, and all the other ones that you've written too are really just so helpful, I think, to today's world, to really try to reinforce these messages about taking care of ourselves and taking care of our peer group, and making sure that we're trying to resolve problems in a positive manner.
That's so true. Okay, that's great. And it also applies to asking questions, being curious about what's going on for a child too, when they are upset. I'm not good at math or whatever. Like,
Right.
what's going on? How can I help you? Instead of our coming in and solving it for them. Kids have
Yeah.
ideas for solving problems.
Yeah, and I would say that, as a school administrator, I definitely, I think, because I have been doing this for a long time, but whenever something happens between two students, I always try to take that perspective also of understanding what happened from each person's perspective, and understanding that we don't know how that all felt to them, and we have certain pieces of information. So whenever something does happen and I need to call a parent, I'm always asking them, I'm telling them what I know about the situation, but I'm asking them to please speak with their child that evening and find out if there's more about the situation that I don't know, right? Because we get a snippet and, something happened, there was a conflict, but everything occurs in a context, right? So It's important to me that children's voices are heard, and that helps the child to feel like that they are working more towards a solution rather than having a punishment or a consequence,
Yeah.
right? Because what we really want is we want them to be able to perhaps have a different response the next time that they get to that circumstance, and remember, like, oh, I've been in this situation before, and what kind of tools do I have to deal with it? Because punishment really is not the way, right? If we know anything, I think it's that we know that that's not
And
the,
exactly.
yeah,
And that's the same idea as the badge.
yeah.
That's something you can hang on to and remember, like, this has happened to me before.
Mhm.
I have tools.
Yeah, and this is the roadmap of how to solve those kinds of problems, and we definitely do that. I think I have students who have kind of visual checklists or reminders and
Mhm.
reinforcements
Yeah, yeah,
of what are the pro-social behaviors that we'd like to see them representing, and then giving them positive reinforcement for that. That is a much
yeah,
cleaner and actually more efficient way of changing behavior than to be consequencing kids for infractions, right? That's the way that we grew up in school. There was really nothing but that, I feel like, a lot in school. In certain circumstances, I had really skilled teachers who did different things, but in general, I think the mindset towards changing behavior and correcting behavior was more punitive. And
yeah,
I think really it's skill building, and this is a good tool that people can use at home or in the classroom to just bring up these issues and discuss how would you respond, and doing that in a larger setting, I think is helpful too, because as you mentioned before, there are other people in the game who maybe could be helpers to the issue, right? It's not all
yeah,
between the two
yeah,
people who are having the conflict. So if anybody in the group can suggest this, that could be helpful, right? What else could we do to solve this solution? Come on, we want to play the game. We don't want to, it's not about that. And I think it makes, from what I've seen on our playground, um, we have kind of used that strategy, and the kids get it. Like, okay, we want to play. We want to play. We don't want to spend our 15 minutes of playtime in watching the two of you have an argument about the ball. That's not fun for
yeah,
anyone. So,
right, right. So let's wind up, Becky, with
yeah.
just a couple of little things. You've been so helpful in
Oh, yeah.
interpreting the story. And this is just an example of somebody could a practice. What do you think they could do in this situation? Write it in, or have someone write it in, or draw it in, something like that. Just trying to build the skills. And here's a badge that kids can cut out, again, fine motor practice. And just remember, again, the reason I put rock, paper, scissors there is because that is usually what solves problems with
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah, that's great. I like the way you've made the activities so that the kids can kind of interact with them and bring the story to life, right? They could sort of
Yeah.
reenact the story.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it, bring it to life. So
Yeah.
thank you again so much. I know you have a lot of things you need to get back to school and handle. Um, and so I appreciate so much your time being with us today.
No problem. I really have enjoyed working with you over the years, and I've seen many children, really benefit from working with you and working on these strategies. I just thank you for all the hard work you've done over the years of helping children and helping our community to have more problem solving skills. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Becky. Okay, take care.
Thank you. Bye.